China's foreign ministry says the US is simply using currency imbalance as an excuse to try and adopt protectionist trade measures. Yin Hang has the details on that story.
In a statement released, China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Ma Zhaoxu says China resolutely opposes the U.S. Senate's move in passing the Currency Exchange Rate Oversight Reform Act 2011. The statement says the bill is using currency imbalance to heighten the currency issue between the two countries. It also makes the argument that the bill violates WTO rules and poses a serious threat to the trade relationship between the two countries. The spokesman is urging the U.S. not to politicize economic and trade issues. He also says the exchange rate of the renminbi is not the root cause of the trade imbalance between China and the U.S. The People's Bank of China says it deeply regrets the currency bill and goes as far as to say it could affect the country's currency reform and lead to a potential trade war. In a written response to media questions, China's central bankers say the Sino-U.S. trade imbalance has many root causes: differences in investment structure, saving and consumption ratios, and the vastly different roles played in the global supply chain by the two countries. The central bank says China will continue to advance currency reform measures in a controlled and gradual process. Figures provided by China's Ministry of Commerce show that China's currency exchange rate is now in tandem with the country's trade structure, with the country's trade surplus accounting for less than 1.5% of the country's GDP. In the meantime, U.S. exports to China have surged around 380% from 2001 to the end of 2010 to reach around $92 billion. Yin Hang, CCTV.
Well, hello again, and I'm glad you're back. And today we're going to talk about currency and how currency manipulation and economic decision-making, interest rates and inflation, have impacted the relationship between China and the United States. Since most people don't really understand currency and may find it a little bit intimidating, I thought that I should provide some simple background as a basis for you to understand the economic friction that's developed between the United States today and China. You may recall the historical case of Germany during the 1920s, when inflation became so vast that the currency came to have no value. I remember my German teacher in college telling about how he and his father had taken the copper pipes out of their home and taken it down to the bakery so that they could get food for the family to carry them through the crisis period. That's something that should never be repeated. But one of the effects of that tremendous inflation was that debt had no meaning. People who had borrowed money suddenly were able to repay it in currency that had almost no value. So, yeah, you had a mortgage on your house, now you own the house free and clear. Doesn't get any simpler than that. It was of great benefit for people who had borrowed money, but it was disastrous for people who had lent money. It helped people who lived beyond their means, and it hurt people who saved. That's the nature of inflation in an economy. But to come back to what we're talking about today, for purposes of international economics, a country's total economy is similar to a corporation, just like the corporations that are traded on the stock exchange. We know that the value of corporate stocks vary from day to day. They vary with how well the corporation's business is doing. They also vary with changes in the overall economic outlook. A country's currency is the same as a share of stock. A dollar bill is really no more than a share of stock in our American enterprise. When a corporation encounters tough times, it may borrow money to tide it over. If the corporation continues to fail, however, lenders will eventually stop lending it money, and that will cause it to have to discontinue all operations. The company then may be sold for whatever residual worth it has, and the creditors simply lose the money they've lent to the corporation to the extent that they aren't able to recover anything from the sale of the corporation's assets. Likewise, a country can borrow money to tide it over tough times. When a country can no longer borrow money, however, a crisis ensues and the economy of the country will fall into collapse. Eventually, the economy will settle at whatever worth the country has. This is what is happening today in Greece. Now consider what happens to the value of the shares in a corporation. If the corporation thrives, it is able to pay off its debt and the value of its shares grows. That means that the value of each share can buy more than it could before the company prospered. The same is true of a country. If a country thrives, it is able to reduce its debt, and the value of its currency will grow. That means that the value of the currency can buy more than it could before. The reverse is of course true both of corporations and of countries. Corporations are dependent on the wisdom of their management. Countries are dependent on the wisdom of their political leaders. These basic economic principles are inescapable regardless of the social system by which a country is governed. The same logic applies to centrally planned communist regimes, to social democracies, and to free enterprise cultures. A corporation thrives if its sales are greater than its costs. In short, it makes a profit. Likewise, a country thrives if its production is greater than its cost of production. A country's exports are analogous to a corporation's sales, and its imports are like a cost. This requires a little reflection. Of course, what happens within the economy of the country matters. But when we compare countries, the country will thrive if its exports exceed its imports, as is the case for China today, and the country's value will shrink with the reverse. When imports exceed exports, it means that the people of the country are buying more than what they're sending out. It means that they're living beyond their means. They may be able to borrow to keep that going for a while, but eventually the debt has to be repaid. The debt can be repaid by paying taxes to pay it off, or inflation can take away the value of the currency. If inflation takes away the value of the currency, then the debt is simply repaid with a currency that has much less value than what the lender expected to receive when the loan was made, and the country's credit is likely to be permanently damaged as a result. China has tried to keep its prosperity going by excessive spending. You've seen that in the specter of ghost cities, cities built that people can't afford to live into. The result is that China is encountering high inflation. This is of interest to us. We all know that the United States has lost jobs to China because Chinese workers were paid less than American workers. But as inflation increases the pay to Chinese workers, the gap between the U.S. and China grows smaller. All else being equal, eventually, all the world's economies will converge to the same level of prosperity. Of course, tariffs, import duties, in other words, customs that you pay when you import goods into a country, tariffs can help constrain imports to give the appearance of an advantage. But the result is to reduce economic debt by reducing the standard of living. We benefit from the imports that we have. If we buy a shirt that costs $10 because it's made overseas, if we were to bar those imports, then the cost of the shirt might be $30 and we would have less money to spend on other things, so our standard of living would be reduced. China has been trying to manipulate its structure. It's had control of the banks, which meant that it's able to absolutely fix interest rates, both the interest rates paid on loans and the interest rates paid on savings, and that has been able to work to its advantage. But the United States is trying to call China to account, to bring it into the family of nations so that its economic policies are consistent with those of other countries, and so that the competitive playing field is level, so that those countries that are the best able to perform are able to achieve the best results. With that background, we can look at, with greater understanding, at some of the commentary which will follow now.
The World Economic Forum opened on Wednesday in China's northeastern city of Dalian. Chinese leader Wen Jiabao spoke at the forum, stressing that a, quote, prudent monetary policy will be put in place to control inflation in China.
Chinese leader Wen Jiabao announced on Wednesday plans to use a tight monetary policy to curb inflation. He stressed the Chinese regime will continue its structural reforms to increase consumption so as to sustain economic growth in the country. Speaking at the World Economic Forum in the northeastern city of Dalian, Wen said inflation continues to be the top priority.
We will deal with relatively stable and fast economic growth, reform economic structure, and manage inflation expectation.
China's inflation dropped to 6.2% in August, easing from a three-year high of 6.5%. That is despite analysts expecting it to stay high and above the regime's goal of 4%. The Chinese economy grew by 9.5% in the second quarter. That's a drop from 9.7% in the first quarter, when reiterated the regime's policy on increasing domestic consumption to boost economic growth.
China will stick to the strategy of expanding domestic demand, focusing on adjusting, optimizing its structure, and enhance the pull of consumption demand.
The three-day economic forum, which ends on Friday, draws 1,700 representatives from 90 countries and regions.
China's low cost of labour has helped the nation to become, the world's biggest exporter, helped its rise as an economy. And we know that labour costs are rising significantly.
China can't consume more of the world's goods until its wages go up. In general, it's good for wages to go up in China, and I think it's going to be some time before they export inflation as a result of that. China could have huge productivity gains by eliminating some of this bureaucracy that would allow them to have more stimulus and allow them to have more growth in the long run. If I could just share a quick anecdote. So the CEO of FedEx for Asia is someone I know, and a few years ago he told me FedEx actually literally backs up a truck on the border of one province with an empty truck on the other side and unloads the goods from one truck to the other, because that is actually cheaper than going through the red tape and bureaucracy of authorizing a truck to travel across provincial lines.
So you'd rather have more trucks backing up to this provincial line and meeting another one, rather than go through the time it takes to figure out how to rewrite the regulations so those trucks can actually behave in an efficient way.
Please see below for important disclosures. Read them carefully.
talking with Jim Chanos of Kinnikos Associates. So, Jim, we were talking about China.
Right.
And you and I actually talked before we all started about how nobody really looks at the Chinese government balance sheet in terms of the amount of debt that they have. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, the Chinese government balance sheet directly does not have a lot of debt. It's de minimis. But the fact of the matter is the state-owned enterprises and the local governments and all the other ancillary borrowing vehicles have lots of debt. And it's growing at a very, very fast rate. And the assumption is the state stands behind all this debt. Well, if we look at it on that basis, and Fitch and others have done so too, we see that debt in China, implicitly backed by the Chinese government, probably has gone from somewhere about 100% of GDP to about 200% of GDP recently. And those are numbers that are staggering. Those are European kind of numbers, if not worse.
So what happens? I mean, how do you see it playing out? You talk a lot about a Chinese property bubble.
Right.
If the debt load becomes unmanageable, I mean, what happens to China? I think we all think of it as being so strong financially and fiscally, and yet numbers show a different story.
Well, I just think that's going to be the surprise going into the end of this year and into 2012, that it's not so strong.
End of this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, the property market is hitting the wall right now, and things are decelerating. The CEO of Komatsu said just last week that he's having trouble getting paid for his excavator sales in China. So developers are being squeezed. They're turning to the black market for lending, this sort of shadow banking system, which is now growing by leaps and bounds, like everything in China, sort of starts at nothing and suddenly is huge within a year or two. And regulators over there are really trying to get their hands around the problem. Meantime, the local governments have every incentive to just keep the game going. So they're just continuing with these projects, continuing to borrow, as the central government tries to rein them in.
Now, you've been short Chinese banks, and you continue that?
We're short Chinese banks, the property developers, commodity companies that sell into China. Anything related to property there is still a short.
Anything you like in China?
Yeah, we're long the Macau casinos. It's our long corruption, short property play.
All right, interesting. And you've had that for a while, though.
We have. I mean, again, we feel that there's American management, there's American accounting, there's subsidiaries of American companies, and they're growing at a faster rate even than the property developers.
Hey, you know, one thing we've been talking about the IMF lowering the growth estimates for the world at this point. They did lower it for China as well, but it's still about 9.5%. Right. But is it a trend that you think is going to continue? We're going to continue to see those growth rates brought in on China, and it will indicate some of the worries that you've been pointing out?
Well, look at it this way. I mean, a lot of people are assuming now that half of all new loans in China are going to go bad. In fact, the Chinese government even said that last year relating to the local governments. If we assume that China is going to grow total credit this year between 30 and 40% of GDP, and half of that debt is going to go bad.
How can it be good?
That's 15 to 20%, and say the recoveries on that are 50%. That means that's 7.5 to 10%, Carol. That means that China, on an after write-off basis, may not be growing at all. It may be just simply having to write off some of this stuff down in the future. So its 9% growth may really be zero.
国际货币基金组织最近发出警告说，欧元区债务危机引发的世界经济衰退可能导致中国的经济增长率大幅下降4个百分点。
Many analysts have been predicting the possible effects of Europe's economic woes. Earlier this week, the International Monetary Fund issued a new report detailing how a continued slowdown in Europe's economy could also affect China. Economic experts believe the impact will not only hit China's economy hard, but also shake the Chinese communist regime.
On Monday, the International Monetary Fund released a report forecasting that China's economic growth could experience a substantial decline if Europe's growth falls more than anticipated. The China Economic Outlook published on Monday showed that China's growth rate may lose about 4 percentage points from its current predicted growth, which the International Monetary Fund forecasted at 8.2% as of earlier this year. The IMF issued a report last month showing that the world economy may decrease by 1.75% in total growth. According to the Wall Street Journal, the ratings agency Fitch Ratings said the Chinese economy's hard landing was, quote, potentially the biggest risk for the global economy in 2012. City University of New York economics professor Chen Zhifei said the Chinese economy's hard landing is inevitable and that the impact of the economic slowdown would include soaring inflation and unemployment as well as the collapse of the banking sector.
The consequence is unimaginable. The impact on the world economy will be huge, especially in China.
In addition, Professor Chen also believes that the largest and the most fundamental impact may be reflected in the Chinese regime. Because GDP growth is the biggest political task of the Chinese regime, it gives the regime an excuse to maintain its single-party dictatorship.
If this excuse becomes invalid, it will bring political instability in mass incidents that will force the Communist Party to withdraw from the world stage.
The International Monetary Fund urges the Chinese regime to respond with a significant fiscal package to sharply stimulate its economy.
World trade can create jobs, and that was the main topic today as China's vice president met with congressional leaders in Washington. Xi Jinping, who will be the Chinese president, said U.S.-Chinese relations are at a new starting point. But President Obama, touring a factory in Milwaukee today, took aim at China's trade policies.
I'm going anywhere in the world to open up new markets for American products. And I'm not going to stand by when our competitors don't play by the same rules. It's not fair when foreign manufacturers have a leg up on ours just because they're getting heavy subsidies from their government.
And to get an idea on what American companies are up against, take a look at the U.S. solar panel industry. Bill Whitaker shows us why it's taking such a beating from Chinese competition.
Business is heating up for Randy Bishop, owner of Varengo Solar Plus, one of the top residential solar panel installers in California.
We've added 400 jobs. We expect to add 400 this year as well. These are great jobs that are going to stay here in the U.S.
Fueling the growth, these inexpensive solar panels from China, significantly cheaper than ones made in the USA.
So for a house like this, it would probably be on the order of $3,000 to $5,000 more expensive.
To go with U.S. panels?
To go with U.S. panels.
How do most of your customers decide?
Customers, probably more than 9 times out of 10, vote with their wallet.
While installers might welcome Chinese imports, American panel makers claim the Chinese are unfairly dumping panels on the U.S., killing good American manufacturing jobs. Last year, the biggest U.S. panel maker closed this plant near L.A. 100 jobs were lost. A dozen American manufacturers have gone bankrupt, closed down, or downsized.
Just a few years ago, Chinese products were less than 10% of the U.S. market. Today, they average about half of the U.S. market.
Attorney Tim Brightbill represents 7 American manufacturers suing to have the U.S. Commerce Department slap import taxes on Chinese panels. They say the Chinese solar industry is propped up by huge government subsidies, a violation of international trade rules.
The Energy Department has estimated that China grants more than $30 billion of subsidies to its industry, and all U.S. subsidies amount to only about $1 billion.
Randy Bishop says a trade war could be a disaster just as record numbers of Americans are turning to the sun for energy.
We would significantly slow our growth if solar panel costs were to get more expensive.
A Commerce Department decision whether to levy new taxes on Chinese panels is expected this summer. Bill Whitaker, CBS News, Los Angeles.
For at TV, the world is thinking.
I want to suggest that this is really the wrong question to ask. It's not the end of American empire, it's not the end of American power that we need to worry about, for reasons I'll come back to. That's still pretty secure. The real question we need to ask is whether that special relationship between China and America, that I call Chimerica for short, is in danger of disintegrating. Ladies and gentlemen, if it's the end of Chimerica, then we do have a problem. But you're asking yourself, what does he mean by Chimerica? Chimerica is a word that simply conveys the idea that the most important thing in the world today is the symbiotic relationship between 2 economies, China's and America's. Between them, they may only account for 13% of the world's land surface, but they account for 1/4 of its population, 1/3 of its output, half its carbon emissions, and nearly 2/3 of global economic growth since 2001. A remarkable figure. Now, I don't know how your marriage works, but mine works rather like Chimerica. I save. You know what's coming, don't you? And my wife spends. And that's the Chimerican deal. The Chinese, let's call them the East Chimericans, save like crazy. Here's some numbers for their net national savings as a percentage of gross national income. And it's gone up and up and up since 1970, to the point that savings are nearly 40%, 45% of China's gross national income. It's incredible. Meanwhile, the spendthrift wife in West Chimerica, namely the United States, has just spent and spent and spent, to the point that in 2005, the net national savings of the United States were effectively zero. You could call this the age of leverage. That's how I think of it. And we're living through its end. The age of leverage saw the United States exploit what Ben Bernanke called the Asian savings glut to go on a massive borrowing binge. And here you see the story. In relation to gross domestic product, all kinds of debt in the United States added together, look particularly at the growth of household debt and financial debt, rose from 150% of GDP back in the 1970s to a peak of 350%, 3.5 times the national output of the United States. Now, we all know spendthrift spouses, but in many ways, the spouse, the wife, if I may be so sexist, in the Chimerican partnership, really did max out on every conceivable kind of debt. Now, there were those people who thought this was just fine. There were all kinds of wonderful rationalizations of this a couple of years ago. Bretton Woods II was one. Stable disequilibrium was a phrase that my friend Mohamed El-Erian used. Luckily, I don't think he used it in his new book, When Markets Collide, because it would be rather embarrassing to claim now that this disequilibrium was stable. But here's how it looks. These are current account balances in relation to world GDP, world output. And on the blue lines below the line, below the axis, tell you that mostly it was the United States that was borrowing. And above the line, you see that China and others, it wasn't just China, of course, the oil exporters were doing it too, were accumulating surpluses that were essentially recycled into the US deficit. So the rest of the world's surpluses financed this enormous American deficit.
But I did want to move to the question of currency. There is a unanimity about this issue that is pretty rare across regional party lines in terms of the reality for people's lives. Has the Fed attempted to quantify the magnitude of the impact of this subsidy on the U.S. economy or U.S. jobs? Has there ever been a recent attempt to do that?
No, I don't think so. We have mostly followed work by the IMF and other international agencies, which do find, and also by think tanks, like the Institute for International Economics, which have found that the Chinese currency is undervalued by a significant amount. The exact amount varies according to estimates.
And do you have any sense of the aggregate number of jobs lost that you could attribute to this policy?
I don't have a number. It's difficult to estimate because there are many direct as well as indirect effects. I mean, working through third party, other trading nations, and so on. I think right now a concern is that the Chinese currency policy is blocking what might be a more normal recovery process in the global economy. In particular, we have now a two-speed recovery where advanced industrial countries like the United States and Europe are growing very, very slowly, where emerging market economies are growing quite quickly, and a more normal recovery, more balanced recovery would have some more demand being shifted away from the emerging markets toward the industrial economies. The Chinese currency policy is blocking that process, and so it is, to some extent, hurting the recovery process. So it is certainly a negative. I'm sorry I don't have an exact number.
Thank you very much.